He was here to support his granddaughter at her graduation. But security decided he wasn't welcome. In a minute, the whole event stopped. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. The sun had only just risen over the rolling hills that cradled the quiet campus of Mason Ridge College, casting long, golden shafts of light across dew-speckled grass and red-bricked buildings. It was graduation day, and already the parking lots were filling with SUVs and polished sedans, the air charged with chatter, laughter, and the staccato clicking of camera shutters. Parents in suits and floral dresses stepped out with arms full of balloons, flowers, and gift bags, guided by proud students in caps and gowns. Banners reading "Congratulations, Class of 2025," fluttered in the soft morning breeze above the main entrance, where faculty members in robes greeted families with cheerful nods and ushered them toward the ceremony hall. Down a quiet side road that curved away from the main entrance and wound through the back of the campus, a different vehicle approached. It was an old, sun-faded pickup truck, dusty, with a worn leather dashboard and a cracked windshield that hadn't seen a replacement in decades. Behind the wheel sat a man whose name most of the college staff wouldn't recognize, and whose legacy they wouldn't begin to understand. His name was Charles "Chuck" Norris, and though he had long since stepped away from the public eye, his presence still carried the quiet weight of something immovable, something deeply rooted. He pulled into a gravel spot near the faculty lot and turned off the ignition. The truck made a soft groaning sound before falling silent. Chuck sat for a moment without moving. His eyes, still sharp behind the crow's feet, etched deep into the corners, scanned the area ahead. Families bustled about with excitement and purpose. He didn't belong to any of their conversations. That was fine. He wasn't here for them. Resting on the passenger seat beside him was a neatly folded piece of paper. He picked it up carefully, as if it were something fragile. It was a handwritten letter, creased at the center from having been opened and refolded many times. The ink was dark blue, the handwriting rounded and youthful. His granddaughter's words were short and simple. "Grandpa, you've always been there for me. Sit in the front row. I want to see your face when I walk across that stage. Love, Emma." Chuck read it one more time before sliding the letter into the inside pocket of his jacket. It was a faded denim coat lined with soft flannel that had long since lost its warmth. He wore it not because it was fashionable or comfortable, but because it had memories stitched into its seams. Quiet drives through the desert with his late wife, early mornings walking Emma to school, her tiny hand wrapped around his calloused fingers. He stepped out of the truck with deliberate care, boots crunching against the gravel. His movements were slow, not from weakness, but from a sort of preserved dignity, an economy of motion born from years of knowing exactly what each step meant. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, placed his old cowboy hat squarely atop his head, and began walking toward the auditorium. The path took him past groups of students and family members who glanced at him with fleeting curiosity. He didn't blame them. He was an odd presence here, a man well past retirement age, dressed in clothes that bore the wear of hard years and long roads. His gait was steady, his shoulders broad, though time had settled some weight into them. A couple of younger students gave him polite nods as they passed, unsure whether he was faculty or some student's grandfather. He reached the outer edge of the main crowd and paused. A security checkpoint had been set up just ahead, more for show than necessity, with two bored-looking guards and a folding table with printed guest lists. Everyone else in line clutched invitations or digital passes on their phones. Chuck had neither. just Emma's letter in his pocket and the knowledge that she wanted him up front. That was what mattered. As he stepped into line, he caught one of the guards eyeing him with a mixture of suspicion and amusement. The younger man, tall and lean, leaned toward his partner and said something under his breath. Chuck didn't flinch. He waited until it was his turn, then approached the table. "Name?" the guard asked without looking up. "Norris," Chuck said simply. The guard squinted at the list. "Don't see a Norris here. Got an invite?" Chuck reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded letter. He hesitated a moment, then offered it. The guard barely glanced at the handwriting before waving his hand dismissively. "This isn't official," he said. "It's not even printed." "She asked me to sit in the front row," Chuck replied, his voice calm and firm. The guard shook his head. "If she wanted you in the front row, she should have gone through the proper channels. Look, I'm not trying to be rude, but we've got a lot of guests and limited space. There's a general seating area over that way." He pointed toward a cluster of rows set farther back on the lawn, already half filled with folding chairs and parents fanning themselves beneath the rising sun. Chuck didn't argue. He simply nodded, tucked the letter back into his jacket, and stepped aside. But he didn't go to the general seating. Not yet. He walked around the side of the main tent, where a small gap in the rope barrier led to a shaded corridor. The area was quieter here. He found a corner near the emergency exit door and stood there, hands clasped loosely behind his back. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was waiting for Emma. From his position, he could see the stage clearly, the rows of decorated chairs, the flower arrangements lining the aisle. He also saw the section marked for distinguished guests and families, roped off with silk sashes and little silver signs attached to each chair. He knew those seats were meant for donors, board members, and the families of students with connections. He didn't resent them. He just wanted to be close enough for Emma to see him when she looked out from the stage. Minutes passed. More guests arrived. The crowd thickened. Chuck remained still, unmoving, like an old oak tree that had no intention of swaying. Eventually, a young woman in a headset and a sleek black pantsuit approached, clipboard in hand. She scanned the area, then stopped when she noticed him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, stepping in front of him. "This area is for designated family members only. If you don't have a pass, I'll have to ask you to return to the main seating." Chuck looked her in the eyes. "I'm here for my granddaughter." "I understand, but we have protocols," she replied sharply as if reading from a script. "If your name isn't on the list, you'll need to move. Otherwise, security will be called." He didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "She asked me to be here. That should be enough." The woman didn't respond. She pressed something on her headset and turned away, muttering, "We've got a possible non-cleared guest near the east corridor. Can someone assist?" Chuck exhaled slowly, turned his gaze back to the stage, and said nothing more. He had been in rooms like this before, not ones with ribbons and flowers, but ones where people assumed they knew his story from a glance. Rooms that tried to make him invisible because he didn't fit their vision of importance. But he hadn't come here to fight. He had come because of a promise. A promise to a girl who once stood trembling at her parents' funeral and clutched his hand like it was the last thing keeping her tethered to the earth. Chuck didn't need an official seat. He needed her to see him. That was all. The ceremony was moments from beginning. A voice over the speakers welcomed guests, asked them to silence their phones, and gave instructions for the procession. As the music swelled and families leaned in to take photos, Chuck remained at the edge of the tent, unmoving. From a distance, to the untrained eye, he looked like a man out of place, maybe even a drifter or a confused attendee. But to anyone watching closely, there was something in his stillness that carried weight. He was not lost. He was waiting. And soon, that patience would be tested in ways none of them were ready for. The ceremony had begun. A brass quartet played a warm, soaring rendition of Pomp and Circumstance, while rows of faculty members in colorful academic regalia filed onto the stage with solemn, practiced poise. Parents craned their necks for the best view of their sons and daughters lining up behind the curtain, eager, nervous, and resplendent in flowing gowns and tassels. The air shimmered with excitement and quiet pride. Everywhere Chuck looked, there were flowers, hand-drawn signs, and arms wrapped around shoulders in congratulation. But not for him. He stood at the edge of it all, just under the shaded corner near the emergency exit, his back straight, his gaze steady. His place was peripheral, but not uncertain. He was not lost. He had made a choice to be here, despite the mounting unease that crept ever closer with each passing minute. From his vantage point, Chuck could see the special seating area, a cordoned-off rectangle just a few feet from the stage, filled with padded chairs draped in ivory cloth. Silver name tags, clipped to each one, caught the sunlight in glints. Some bore surnames he didn't recognize. Others were labeled with corporate affiliations, major donors, trustees, local politicians. It was the section Emma had undoubtedly assumed he would be allowed to join, the section her letter had referred to without hesitation. Sit in the front row. Chuck wasn't naive. He knew how the world worked, and he understood how easy it was to be sidelined when you didn't look the part. Still, he had expected, perhaps foolishly, that a quiet letter from a loving granddaughter would be enough. That maybe, just maybe, dignity didn't require credentials, but it was becoming clear that his hope had been misplaced. As the processional music faded and the first speaker approached the podium, Chuck caught sight of a woman moving swiftly down the aisle toward him. She was the same organizer from earlier, the one with the headset and the unblinking stare. She had the clipboard now clutched tightly to her chest like a shield, and her lips were drawn into a hard line of authority. She didn't smile. "You're still here," she said, as if the words themselves were an accusation. Chuck didn't flinch. "I'm waiting for my granddaughter to walk." "Sir, I'm going to ask you again," she said, lowering her voice just enough to seem firm without being overheard. "This area is reserved. You don't have a pass. You're making some of the other guests uncomfortable." He said nothing. His silence wasn't stubbornness. It was the kind of stillness that comes from someone who's been through too much to waste energy proving what doesn't need proving. She shifted her weight impatiently. "I've already notified security. They'll escort you to the general seating. If you continue to refuse, we'll have to take further steps." He could see it now, the way her eyes flicked toward a small group of security officers standing several yards away. They were younger men, dressed in dark slacks and polo shirts marked event services, but their posture was unmistakably aggressive. One of them cracked his knuckles. Another crossed his arms and looked straight at Chuck like a challenge. But it wasn't their stares that stung. It was the assumptions underneath them. The assumption that he didn't belong, that he was intruding, that he was just an old man too proud or too confused to follow instructions. They didn't see the man who had once walked through dust-choked villages in uniform, who had carried more weight than most of them would ever understand. They saw a relic, a nobody. And that stung more than Chuck wanted to admit. The organizer turned away, speaking into her headset again as she moved toward the stage. Chuck heard fragments of her words. Still there, not on the list. We'll move him soon. He sighed softly and turned his eyes back to the platform where the dean had now taken the microphone and was welcoming families and graduates to the most important day of their academic lives. It was a good speech. Chuck could tell. The crowd laughed at the right times, clapped when prompted. The dean's voice was polished, theatrical, the way a man's voice becomes after years of speaking to rooms that were already listening. Chuck remained still. People began noticing him now. Not many, but enough. A few parents in the front row looked over their shoulders with puzzled expressions. One woman whispered something to her husband. A student in the second row smirked and nudged her friend, who turned and openly giggled. Chuck heard a camera shutter click and knew, without looking, that someone had decided he was worth recording. The security guards started moving. He watched them through the corners of his eyes. 3 of them now, fanning out with casual precision, as if flanking a threat. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't stepped out of bounds or raised his voice. But his mere presence was an affront to the careful image this ceremony tried to project. Controlled, elegant, photogenic. There was no room in that picture for someone like him. Not without credentials, not without polish. As the guards approached, one of them, a tall man with a military-style haircut, spoke up first. "Sir, you're going to have to move to the designated seating area." Chuck nodded slowly, his tone unchanged. "I told the lady already. My granddaughter asked me to sit up front. I'm here for her." "You don't have a pass." "I have her letter." "That's not the same thing." Chuck didn't argue. He had learned long ago that arguing with people who had already made up their minds was like pushing water uphill. One of the other guards, younger and stockier, stepped in closer. "We've been real patient, sir, but we've got rules, and you're not above them. Now let's go." He reached out, hand closing around Chuck's upper arm. Chuck's muscles tensed, not in fear, but from something deeper, something instinctual. The contact was brief. The grip wasn't painful, but it was unwelcome. Chuck turned his head slightly and met the young man's eyes. "I'd let go if I were you," he said softly, but the guard didn't listen. From the stage, the speakers continued. Names were read aloud, applause echoed, cameras flashed, but here, just to the side of it all, something else was building, something heavier. Chuck exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing just slightly. He knew this moment wasn't the one. Not yet. But it was coming. He could feel it in the way the guards squared their shoulders, in the way the organizer kept glancing over with tight-lipped expectation. They weren't going to let this go. They were going to make him leave, one way or another. And still, through it all, he stood his ground. He wasn't angry, not yet. But something had shifted inside him. The weight of being seen as nothing had started pressing harder than he could ignore. It wasn't pride, it wasn't ego, it was justice. Small, personal, and quiet. The third guard spoke now. "Look, man, don't make us drag you out in front of everyone. Let's not ruin the day." Chuck looked at the stage. Emma wasn't out yet. He hadn't seen her. He couldn't leave. Not now. "I'm not ruining anything," he said. "I'm just standing here." The tall one stepped forward again. Not for long. That was when one of them shoved him. It wasn't violent, just a quick, sharp push on the shoulder to make him move. But it was the wrong move, not because of what it did physically, but because of what it said. It said, "You don't matter." Chuck staggered half a step, then stopped himself. His boots found solid ground again, and he straightened. Slowly, deliberately. His eyes lost their softness. The push didn't hurt, but the meaning did. And now, something old and precise inside of him came to life. Not rage, not adrenaline, just readiness. He knew it wouldn't take much, a few steps, a few measured movements, but not yet, because the moment wasn't fully ripe. Not yet. First, there had to be silence, and soon it would come. Chuck had never been one to let emotion surface without purpose. He had been trained, both by the military and by life itself, to control impulse, to wait for the right moment, to understand the terrain before making a move. But, as he stood there, surrounded now by 3 security guards and watched as parents laughed, cameras flashed, and names were called from the stage like nothing was wrong, he felt the weight of humiliation settling into his bones, not for what they thought of him, but for the simple fact that it was happening in front of his granddaughter's world. He had promised her he would be there. She had asked him for one thing, and he had shown up for it. And now they were trying to erase him, like he was a mistake that wandered into the wrong moment. The tall guard shifted his stance, cracking his neck like he was warming up for something more than words. The others circled slowly, not aggressive yet, but impatient, with that arrogant assurance that comes from dealing with people who usually back down. Chuck didn't flinch. He had faced worse. He had stood before people who meant real harm, not petty enforcers of meaningless rules. Still, the sting of the situation dug deeper than it should have. Not because he was afraid, he wasn't, but because every second they kept him here was one more second stolen from the promise he'd made. "You've had your chance, old man," the shorter guard said, stepping forward again. "Let's move." He reached out again, this time not just grabbing but yanking at Chuck's arm with a kind of practiced disrespect, like he was used to manhandling the unimportant. The force wasn't overwhelming, but it was careless and unnecessary, and it crossed the last line Chuck was willing to let slide. The instant the man's hand clamped down, Chuck's body moved, not violently, not with anger, but with calm, precise efficiency. His left hand swept up, caught the wrist, and rotated it outward in a fluid arc. The guard's balance shifted involuntarily, his knees buckling just slightly from the sudden torque. With almost no visible force, Chuck guided him downward until one leg folded and the man staggered to the side, landing hard on his backside in the grass. The man cried out, more from surprise than pain. Before the other 2 could react, Chuck turned his gaze on them with the same composure he might have used to check a broken fence post or assess a broken engine. Cold, efficient, unbothered. The taller guard charged, angry now, fists raised in a way that made it clear he had something to prove. Chuck took a half step to the side, pivoted, and swept one boot low across the grass. The man's momentum worked against him. His feet left the ground, and he thudded down on his back with a loud grunt, the breath knocked clean from his lungs. The third guard froze, arms mid-motion. His eyes flicked to the others, one groaning on the ground, the other on all fours trying to stand. He hesitated, then took a cautious step back. Chuck didn't advance. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't say a word. He simply stood between them and the stage, boots rooted, breathing even. A few people had turned by now. Someone gasped. A man with a DSLR camera lowered it from his face, brows furrowed. The ripple of silence spread like ink in water. The master of ceremonies, oblivious to the shift just beyond the curtain, continued reading names. "And now," the voice boomed, "we welcome one of our top honors students, recipient of the Ridge Memorial Academic Fellowship." The crowd clapped. Chuck didn't. The girl in the headset appeared again, rushing toward the scene with frantic steps and a look of horror widening across her face. She had expected him to be gone. Now, not only was he still here, he had disarmed 2 of her guards without breaking a sweat. "What the hell is going on?" she hissed as she arrived, her voice just above a whisper, not wanting to draw attention yet unable to hide her panic. "He attacked us," one of the guards groaned, still trying to rise. Chuck looked at her calm as ever. "I told you, I came for my granddaughter." "This is unacceptable," she snapped. "I'm calling the police." He nodded once. "You do what you think is necessary." The words weren't a threat. They were a simple acknowledgement of inevitability. He knew she wouldn't back down. People like her never did, not when they were embarrassed. They doubled down, and that's exactly what she did. She turned away, speaking rapidly into her headset, calling for reinforcements, her voice tight with indignation. Chuck watched her go, then turned his attention back to the stage. Still no Emma. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. He didn't feel victorious. He felt tired of people who mistook control for authority, who believed uniforms gave them permission to forget decency. A ripple of new movement in the crowd drew his attention. People were whispering now, heads turned in his direction. A few stood halfway out of their chairs, trying to get a better look. Word was spreading. An incident, a disturbance, maybe even a fight. But no one knew the full story. On stage, the speaker paused to sip water. Somewhere off to the side, the MC gestured to delay the next name. Confusion fluttered through the air like static before a storm. Then, from just behind the curtain, Chuck caught a glimpse of a young woman in a deep blue gown, cap tilted slightly to the side, clutching a program in her trembling hands. Emma. She was waiting to be called. She hadn't seen him yet. Chuck stepped back slightly, not wanting her to witness what was happening, but it was too late. She turned her head, maybe to scan the crowd, maybe by chance, and locked eyes with him. For a moment, she didn't understand. Her brow furrowed. Then her gaze dropped, saw the security guards around him, the clipboard-wielding organizer, the concerned crowd. Her expression shifted, horror spreading across her face like ink through water. She started moving. One of the stage assistants tried to stop her, but she brushed past, walking down the steps, across the narrow aisle, ignoring whispered protests from faculty in their robes. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She just walked, with a kind of quiet fury that reminded Chuck of her mother. She reached him in less than a minute, her small hand slipping into his like it had 100 times before. She didn't speak at first. She just stood beside him. Then she looked at the guards, then at the organizer, and finally at the gathering crowd. "This man," she said, her voice louder than anyone expected, "is my grandfather." More whispers. Heads turning, phones rising. People wanted to hear, to record, to capture whatever this was turning into. "He raised me when I had no one," she continued, the tremble in her voice now woven into something stronger. "He walked me to school every day. He stayed up at night when I cried. He fixed the roof when it leaked and worked overtime to make sure I had what I needed. He's the reason I'm on that stage today." Her eyes swept the front rows, the same rows where no one had made room for him. Some people averted their eyes. "I asked him," she said, holding up a small printed card now smudged from her hand, "to sit in the front row." She turned to the organizer. You told him he didn't belong. You had no idea who you were talking to." The woman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked down at her clipboard like it might offer an escape. Emma wasn't done. She turned back to the crowd. "I don't care about official guest lists. I don't care about protocol. I care about respect. And you just disrespected the man who made this possible." The crowd was silent now. You could hear the rustle of leaves on the trees behind the auditorium. Chuck stood quietly beside her, saying nothing. He didn't need to. The moment was no longer his to carry. Emma had taken it, lifted it, made it visible. And there, in that stillness, the weight of humiliation began to shift, slowly, subtly, into something else. Recognition. The guards said nothing. The organizer backed away, and in the center of the silence, Chuck Norris stood not as a relic, not as an outsider, but as the man he had always been, a protector, a promise keeper, a grandfather who had shown up just like he said he would. The silence that followed Emma's words was heavier than any applause could have been. It was a silence that bore weight, a silence full of unsaid apologies, quiet acknowledgments, and the uncomfortable sound of judgment unraveling in real time. For the first time since Chuck had arrived, no one moved to stop him. No one reached for his arm or gestured for him to step away. And yet there was still something unspoken in the air. A tension not yet broken, a discomfort that wouldn't be eased simply by words, even sincere ones. Chuck stood next to his granddaughter with the same quiet stillness he'd maintained since the moment he arrived. He hadn't spoken during her speech. He hadn't needed to. But now, as she looked up at him, her hand still resting in his, he felt a swell of something deeper than pride, a fierce, unshakable bond. She had stood for him, spoken for him, and in doing so she had done more than reclaim his dignity. She had transformed it into something visible to everyone else, but not everyone was ready to accept that change. A new voice broke through the hush, sharp and irritated. The voice of the event coordinator, an older man in a fitted navy blazer with a small pin on his lapel indicating his role in administration. He stepped forward with quick, angry strides, his face tight with authority offended. "What is this?" he snapped, glancing at the scattered guards and the retreating event planner, who now lingered behind a pillar pretending to be busy with her earpiece. Emma turned to him first. "This is my grandfather. I invited him." "This is a formal event," the man said. "We have procedures for a reason. He disrupted security. He assaulted personnel." "He defended himself," Emma said calmly. "They laid hands on him first." The man's jaw clenched. "I don't care what the story is. If this escalates, we'll have to call law enforcement." Chuck finally looked at him. His voice was calm, clear, and free of emotion. "You do what you need to do." The administrator's eyes flicked to the growing crowd, aware now that many more people were watching. Students, families, even some faculty members had turned in their seats. The news was traveling quickly. Phones were out. Some were recording. Others were simply capturing still images of the old man in the denim jacket and cowboy hat standing beside the honor student in her cap and gown. "Listen," the man said more quietly now, trying to regain control. "Why don't we resolve this after the ceremony? We have a schedule to follow." Emma's chin rose slightly. "Not until he's seated." "Look, Miss Norris," the man tried again, but his words trailed off as Chuck stepped forward. Just one step, just enough to close the small space between him and the administrator. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point a finger. He didn't threaten. He just looked the man in the eye and said, "You've got a lot of important people here today, a lot of speeches, a lot of cameras. But none of that matters if you forget what this day's about. It's about showing up, that's all. Showing up when it counts." The man blinked, unsettled by the gravity behind the quiet words. Chuck continued, "I didn't come here to make a scene. I didn't come here to teach anyone a lesson. I came because she asked me to be here. And I won't move until I see her walk across that stage." Behind him, one of the guards had finally risen to his feet and was rubbing his shoulder with a wince. He didn't move to challenge Chuck again. He just stood there, humbled, the fire gone from his eyes. The administrator hesitated. He was cornered by principle. To eject Chuck now would be to admit he was more invested in procedure than people. But allowing him to stay meant acknowledging that everything leading up to this moment had been a mistake. The crowd made the decision for him. It started as a single sound, a chair scraping backward, then another, then 3 or 4. People were standing up, turning around, making space. Parents, students, teachers. Without fanfare, without applause. They weren't cheering. They weren't clapping. They were just moving, clearing a path. Emma squeezed Chuck's hand gently. The administrator took a slow step back, swallowing whatever response he had been preparing. Chuck didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply gave Emma a small nod and followed her as she led him forward, down the center aisle that had once been closed to him. The guards didn't follow. The event planner didn't speak. No one blocked their way. They walked together, side by side, the proud graduate and the man she never stopped believing in. When they reached the front row, Emma paused and looked to the seat she had reserved in her mind so long ago. There was no nameplate on it, no silver tag, no velvet rope, just an empty seat among the well-dressed families who now shifted uncomfortably in their places. Chuck turned to her, his voice low. "You don't have to do this." "Yes," she said, her eyes shining. "I do." He stepped past her and lowered himself slowly into the seat. The fabric cushion gave under his weight with a soft sigh. For the first time that morning, Chuck relaxed just slightly. His shoulders eased. His hands rested on his knees. Emma sat beside him, proud and defiant. Around them, the crowd gradually returned to their seats. The murmurs died down. The MC at the podium adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and glanced toward the wings for approval. And just like that, the ceremony resumed. But everything had changed. The next few names were called, and applause returned, though not as vibrant as before. The illusion of control had cracked, and beneath it, something real had taken its place. From his seat, Chuck watched the graduates step forward one by one. He didn't know their names, didn't know their stories, but he watched them with the same intensity he had given every movement that morning. Because each one was someone's Emma. Each one had someone in the crowd waiting, watching, hoping to be seen. The administrator stood at the side of the stage now, arms folded, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt again. Occasionally, someone glanced over at Chuck, some with curiosity, others with guilt, a few with admiration. But he wasn't looking for their eyes. He was watching the stage, waiting. And when the name Emma Grace Norris echoed through the speakers, he stood. Not quickly, not dramatically, just with the quiet pride of a man who had fulfilled a promise. Emma walked across the stage to thunderous applause. Her name, once a simple string of syllables, now carried weight. The kind of weight that comes from standing for something greater than yourself. She turned to the audience, met Chuck's eyes, and smiled. He didn't wave, he didn't clap, he just nodded. And in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The resistance wasn't about fists or fury. It was about presence. It was about standing your ground not with violence, but with quiet, immovable purpose. Chuck had not come to fight. But when the fight found him, he did what he always did. He stood, the ceremony carried on, but something fundamental had shifted in the air. What had started as another orchestrated pageant of caps, gowns, and institutional pride had taken on a weightier tone, a sense of solemnity that settled over the gathering like the hush before a storm. The stage lights gleamed no brighter than before, and the script continued as rehearsed, but the audience no longer sat with idle smiles or distracted glances. They had witnessed something unplanned, something outside the borders of formality, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Chuck sat in the front row now, not by invitation from the administration, not because someone handed him a name badge or guided him by the elbow, but because his granddaughter had asked him to be there, and he had refused to be moved. His presence, once challenged, now stood unquestioned. Yet even as he sat beside Emma, his posture straight and his gaze fixed on the stage, there was no sense of victory in his demeanor. He had not claimed a seat to make a statement. He had not stood to be applauded. He had only come to fulfill a promise, and now, having kept it, he was content to fade into the background again. But the room wouldn't let him. Whispers passed like wind among the rows behind him. People murmured to one another with cautious reverence. Some used his name, those who recognized him not just from the morning's incident, but from decades past. Some simply referred to him as the grandfather, or that man, or, in quieter, more curious tones, was that really Chuck Norris? And indeed it was. Though most of the room had forgotten his name, or more precisely, had never expected to see it walk in worn boots and a sun-bleached jacket on graduation day, there were still those who remembered. Not just the image from action movies or martial arts competitions, but the man beneath the myth. The man who had served with distinction, who had walked through the fire and come back, not with medals paraded on a chest, but with scars time had refused to polish. Among the faculty, seated across the stage, one older professor leaned toward another, whispering something about having met him once, long ago, during a charity event for veterans. The dean himself, seated stiffly behind the podium, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had watched the confrontation unfold from a distance, helpless to intervene once the crowd took control. Now, his notes sat on his lap, untouched, and his rehearsed closing remarks felt paper-thin in the wake of what had just transpired. Emma's speech, though brief and spontaneous, had pierced the heart of the room. Her defense of her grandfather had carried more gravity than any honorary address. There was no plaque, no title, no honorary degree, but what she gave him was far greater. Truth, spoken plainly with the force of love and conviction. And it was that truth that had pulled the curtain back on the polished ceremony and shown everyone a glimpse of what mattered beyond the decorations and programs. Chuck remained silent. Even as people glanced at him, some cautiously, others with shame, he neither returned their stares nor avoided them. He simply watched as graduate after graduate was called, clapped for them with quiet dignity, and waited. He waited not just for the ceremony to end, but for the world to settle again, for the noise to die down so that the meaning of the moment could speak clearly. When the final graduate walked across the stage and the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone, the man's voice faltered. For the first time that morning, he abandoned the scripted notes in front of him and addressed the audience with a hesitant pause. "Before we close today's ceremony," he said, "I believe we owe a moment of acknowledgement, perhaps overdue, to those whose presence here reminds us what real commitment looks like. He didn't say Chuck's name. He didn't need to. People began to shift again in their seats, looking toward the front row. The MC cleared his throat and continued. To all the families who supported these graduates, in ways seen and unseen, we thank you. And to the ones who showed up, who stood their ground, who gave everything they had for someone else's future, we see you. There was a brief silence, then a ripple of applause. It began cautiously, tentatively, as though the crowd was unsure whether it was allowed, but it grew. And soon the entire auditorium was clapping, not with the raucous enthusiasm of celebration, but with the slow, respectful cadence of recognition. Chuck didn't stand. He didn't wave. He sat still, his hands folded on his lap, his eyes on the stage. His granddaughter looked at him, her eyes glistening again, but this time with peace instead of fire. One by one, people began to rise, not all, not in unison, but in honest, unscripted response. Some stood for a moment and then sat again. Others remained standing, hands still moving in applause. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was something quieter, more sacred, an acknowledgement, a correction. The event planner, now seated near the aisle with her clipboard limp in her lap, didn't move. Her eyes were downcast, and her face was pale. She had expected the day to go according to plan. She hadn't prepared for dignity in old boots and a frayed collar. As the ceremony drew to a close and the traditional tossing of caps filled the air like a burst of black and gold petals, the room shifted once more from silence to celebration. Families surged forward to meet their graduates. Photos were taken, balloons handed out. Yet, even amidst the commotion, a space remained around Chuck and Emma. Not out of fear or exclusion, but out of respect. Emma stood first, helping Chuck rise with gentle hands. He moved slowly, not from weakness, but from years of learned caution. His knees weren't what they used to be, but his back was straight and his steps were sure. As they began to walk up the aisle, people turned to greet them. Some students extended hands, others simply nodded. A young man in a crisp suit stopped them briefly. "Sir," he said, "I just wanted to say thank you." Chuck nodded once, accepting it without embellishment. Outside the auditorium, the sun had risen high, casting the courtyard in full light. Families clustered for group photos beneath the ivy-covered archways. Emma paused to take a few pictures with her classmates, who now treated her with a newfound reverence. But always she returned to Chuck's side. Then something unexpected happened. An older woman approached. Her dress was elegant, her posture poised, but there was an unmistakable nervousness in her expression. She clutched a small purse in front of her like a shield. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice wavering slightly, "I judged you. When you first walked in, I thought you didn't belong. I'm sorry." Chuck looked at her for a long moment. Then he offered a small smile, warm but restrained. "Thank you," he said simply. Another person came, then another, a line of students, parents, even a faculty member. One by one, they spoke. No speeches, no rehearsed lines, just quiet offerings of recognition. One girl, tears in her eyes, simply whispered, "I wish my grandfather could have seen me today." Chuck touched her shoulder gently and nodded. It was only later, when the courtyard began to empty and the decorations were being removed, that the dean himself approached. He looked uncomfortable, his tie loosened, the sun reddening his cheeks. "I didn't handle this well," he admitted. Chuck said nothing. The dean shifted. Your granddaughter is remarkable. I understand now. I'm sorry we didn't treat you with the respect you deserved." Chuck's voice was low, almost lost in the hum of cleanup crews and departing cars. "You don't have to apologize to me," he said. "Just remember the next one. They won't all have someone to stand up for them." The dean nodded, visibly affected, then stepped away. Emma returned to Chuck's side and slipped her arm through his. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, the warmth between them unspoken but immense. "You ready to go?" she asked. Chuck nodded. They walked together across the campus lawn, past the banners now sagging in the heat, past the places where earlier someone had told him he didn't belong. But now no one stopped him. They didn't need to, because recognition had finally arrived, not with fanfare, not with speeches, but with quiet, undeniable truth. And for Chuck Norris, that was more than enough. Long after the last cap had landed on the grass and the cheers had faded into soft conversation, the courtyard of Mason Ridge College stood bathed in warm, late afternoon sunlight. Families lingered, their steps slow and reluctant, as though hesitant to let the day end. The once bustling celebration had thinned to scattered pockets of laughter and camera flashes. Volunteers began folding chairs and collecting empty water bottles, while the final notes of a string quartet's music drifted off into silence. For many, the event was over, but for Chuck, something quieter, more important, had just begun. He remained near the garden pathway with Emma beside him, watching without urgency as the ceremonial infrastructure was gently dismantled. The velvet ropes were packed away, the podium taken down, the stage disassembled plank by plank. It was always like this, he thought. First came the noise, then the truth. Only in the quiet moments after did people reveal what they had truly seen. Emma had changed out of her gown now, but her mortarboard remained perched atop her curls, its tassels swaying as she moved. She had taken dozens of pictures, fielded hugs from classmates and greetings from professors, but she never strayed far from Chuck. He noticed that her steps always curved back to him, like a tether pulled gently by gravity. She didn't say much, and neither did he. They didn't need to. What had needed to be said had already echoed through the auditorium. The moment of confrontation and recognition had not bloomed into any grander spectacle. No banner had dropped from the ceiling. No official had handed him a certificate of apology, and Chuck was grateful for that. He had never been drawn to performance. It was enough to know the truth had surfaced, had been seen by those who had tried to ignore it. It was enough to have kept his promise to his granddaughter. That, and nothing else, had been the purpose of this day. One by one, people still approached him. A father in a gray suit walked over with his teenage son and extended a hand. "I didn't say anything earlier," the man said, "but I should have. Thank you for standing your ground." Chuck shook his hand without a word. The boy beside him looked at Chuck with a kind of wide-eyed respect that went beyond fame or reputation. It was the look a child gives a man who did something he knows he couldn't. Next came a faculty member, a literature professor with a tweed blazer and a name badge that had lost its stiffness during the heat of the day. He simply bowed his head and said, "We need more men like you in front rows." Another young woman, perhaps no older than Emma, approached with tear-stained cheeks and trembling hands. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She pressed her fingers gently against Chuck's shoulder, held them there for a moment, and then turned and walked away. Chuck watched her go, unsure of her story but certain that something in his presence had spoken to it. None of these moments were loud. None were designed for documentation. No one called attention to them. but they mattered. Each one layered silently onto the foundation of a day that had nearly been stolen from him. The woman from earlier, the one who had tried to keep him from entering the front row, stood off to the side now. Her clipboard was nowhere to be seen. She watched from a distance, frozen in that awkward place between regret and uncertainty. Chuck saw her, but he did not beckon. He held no anger. He simply allowed her to live with the memories she had made for herself. Sometimes the greatest punishment was realizing you'd failed your own standard of decency, and Chuck knew better than to rob her of that reckoning. As the sun dipped lower, long shadows stretched across the quad and the temperature cooled. Emma came to stand beside him again, holding a small bottle of water, which she passed to him without a word. He accepted it, twisted off the cap, and drank. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but something about the stillness of the moment gave it weight. He glanced at her and spoke for the first time in nearly an hour. "You did good up there." Emma's eyes glistened. "I just said the truth." Chuck nodded. "That's the hardest thing to say when everyone's already decided what they want to hear." They stood in silence again until a sudden voice broke it, clear and slightly uncertain. "Mr. Norris." They turned to see a young man in military dress approaching with a measured gait. He was no more than 30, his posture unmistakable, his jaw freshly shaven. He stopped in front of Chuck and opened his hand. In his palm lay a small circular metal coin, no bigger than a quarter, yet unmistakably heavy with meaning. Chuck's eyes dropped to it, then slowly rose to meet the man's. "A challenge coin," the man said, "from our unit. You probably don't remember me. I was a private when you visited us in Kuwait in '06. You said 3 sentences to me. I've never forgotten them." He offered the coin forward. Chuck hesitated, then took it gently. On one side was the emblem of the unit. On the other, 5 engraved words. The quiet ones led loudest wars. Chuck closed his hand around it slowly. His fingers curled over the metal, and for the briefest moment, something in his shoulders relaxed. It wasn't release, it wasn't relief, but it was something close. "Thank you," Chuck said quietly. "No, sir," the young man replied. "Thank you." He saluted, and Chuck returned it, not with sharp formality, but with the grace of a man who understood what it cost to earn. The young soldier turned and left. Emma's hand gently reached for Chuck's arm, resting there like a quiet anchor. The crowd thinned further. Maintenance staff began wheeling away tables, folding signs, and collecting the last of the day's debris. But around Chuck and Emma, no one rushed. No one hurried them along. They were an unmoving center in a world slowly being packed away. Eventually, Emma said, "Ready to head out?" Chuck looked toward the setting sun, toward the gate where he'd been stopped that morning, toward the velvet ropes that had once blocked his way. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." They walked together across the grass, Emma still in her flats, her gown draped over her arm, and Chuck in his faded boots that struck the ground with the deliberate rhythm of a man who never forgot the ground he walked on. As they passed the administrative office, someone inside drew a curtain closed. As they passed the parking lot, a family stopped talking and simply watched them go. At the edge of the lot, where Chuck's dusty old pickup still waited in the same place he'd left it, they paused. Emma turned to face him, her eyes searching. "I know today wasn't easy," she said, "but I'm so glad you came." Chuck placed a hand on her shoulder. "I told you I'd be here." She nodded, her throat tight. "You didn't just show up, Grandpa. You showed them." Chuck shook his head. "I didn't come to show them anything, but they saw it anyway." He opened the passenger door and gestured for her to get in. She slid into the seat, hugging her gown close. Chuck walked around, climbed behind the wheel, and started the engine. The old truck rumbled to life like a stubborn mule wakened from a nap. As they pulled out of the parking lot, the college receded behind them in the rearview mirror. The banners flapped in the wind. The lawn was emptying, but something had been left behind. Something intangible, yet deeply felt. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a victory march. It was just one man refusing to be told where he didn't belong. And because of that, he had changed the room. Without a fist, without a shout, without a demand. Only by being there and staying. Because sometimes the most powerful form of resistance doesn't make a sound. It simply refuses to leave. The road back from Mason Ridge wound like a quiet ribbon through the Virginia hills, lined with tall trees that dappled the setting sun in gold. Chuck drove in silence, the old pickup humming steadily beneath them as the miles slipped by. Emma sat beside him, her bare feet propped gently on the edge of the dashboard, her graduation cap in her lap. Neither of them had spoken for a while. Not out of awkwardness or fatigue, but from a mutual understanding that there was no need to fill the quiet. After all, the day had spoken enough for both of them. The world outside moved slowly. Farms passed by in wide swaths, barns nestled among fields, the occasional lone windmill turning lazily in the breeze. The noise of the ceremony, the speeches, the applause, the confrontation, the murmurs of the crowd, had long since faded. What remained was stillness, and within that stillness, the truth of what had occurred lingered like something sacred. Chuck kept his eyes on the road, his hands firm on the wheel. There was something about the way he drove. Something deliberate and steady, like he was guiding more than just a vehicle. Like he was holding the weight of the entire day with each mile. Emma watched him from the corner of her eye. She could still feel the echo of her heartbeat when she had seen him surrounded by guards. The burn of anger when she heard the coordinator's voice dismissing him. The tremble in her own voice when she stood at the microphone and said what no one else had dared. She didn't know if what she'd done had changed anything, but she knew this. It had been necessary. "I think you scared some people," she said finally, her voice soft, almost amused. Chuck gave a small smile, eyes still forward. "I didn't touch the last one. That's what scared them the most." He chuckled once, but the sound didn't carry bitterness. It carried something else, something like peace. Back at the campus, no one had dared to approach them as they left. The security guards had disappeared into the building. The event planner had turned her back and stayed that way. Even the dean had let them pass without a word. It wasn't fear that kept them quiet. It was the shame of having failed a test they didn't realize they were taking. After they reached the old country road that led to Chuck's house, a modest place with a long porch and a weather-worn fence, they saw the sky begin to change. The last light of day stretched thin across the fields, brushing the tops of tall grass with fire. Birds wheeled in the distance, silhouetted against the sun. Emma stepped out of the truck as soon as it stopped, turning slowly in place to take it all in. There was something about returning to where things began that made the day feel complete. Chuck climbed out after her, joints aching in that quiet, persistent way that reminded him of his age. He didn't complain. He never had. Inside the house, everything was just as it had been that morning. A few dishes in the sink, a folded flannel shirt on the back of a kitchen chair, a photo of Emma's parents on the mantel beside a small frame drawing she'd made when she was 5, 2 stick figures, and a tall cowboy hat. He made coffee, even though it was nearly dark. She didn't stop him. They sat on the porch with the mugs between them, the silence deeper now, stretching out like the horizon. Fireflies had begun to blink in the distance, and the occasional chirp of crickets filled the space left behind by words. It was Emma who broke the quiet this time. "I don't think I'll forget today," she said. Chuck took a sip. "Most people won't." She looked at him, not because of me. He turned his head slowly, met her eyes. "No," he said, "because of both of us." For a moment, she looked like she might say more, but then she simply nodded. Sometimes understanding didn't need explanation. Later, after the sky had gone fully dark and the porch light cast a warm glow across the steps, they moved back inside. Emma went to the guest room, her old room, still painted in the faded teal from when she was 13. Chuck moved through the kitchen, rinsing their mugs and wiping down the counter, movements etched in years of routine. When the house had quieted again, Chuck walked into his own room and opened the drawer of his nightstand. He pulled out the small folded letter Emma had sent him and unfolded it for the 100th time. The edges were worn now. The ink faded where his thumb had pressed over the same words again and again. "Grandpa, sit in the front row. I want to see your face when I walk across that stage. Love, Emma." He read it slowly, then folded it back and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He had kept it there all day, close to his heart, and it felt right that it should stay there now. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. The world was moving on, already shifting to the next thing, the next celebration, the next story. But Chuck wasn't in a hurry to move with it. He had always believed that the quiet at the end of a day was just as important as the loud middle, that what came after the applause was where the truth really lived. He thought of the girl who had saluted him with tears in her eyes, the father who had gripped his hand and said, "Thank you," the soldier who had pressed the challenge coin into his palm. None of those people had known him an hour before, and yet somehow they had understood. The next morning, Chuck rose early, as he always did. He made breakfast before Emma woke up: eggs, toast, black coffee. When she wandered into the kitchen, barefoot and bleary-eyed, she found him already dressed, sitting at the table with a small pile of folded papers beside him. "What's that?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "Letters," he said. "Old ones." She sat across from him, picking at the toast. "From your time in the service?" He nodded. "Most from men who didn't come home. I kept them. Never showed anyone." Emma looked at him quietly. Then, reaching forward, she placed her hand on the top of the pile. "You showed me." Chuck looked at her with something close to wonder. "I think that's the best thing I've done today," he said. They finished breakfast in companionable silence, the kind that didn't require filling. Later, when Emma packed her bag to return to the city and her new job, her new life, Chuck walked her to the truck. The same old vehicle stood waiting, now slightly cleaner thanks to her impromptu wash the evening before. She climbed in, then leaned out the window. "I meant what I said," she told him. "I'll always stand for you." He looked up at her, sun catching the brim of his hat. "You did more than that. You reminded them what standing even means." She smiled, put the truck into gear, and pulled away. He watched her go until the dust from the wheels had settled, then turned back toward the house. The porch creaked under his boots. The door groaned softly on its hinges. He returned to his chair, opened the small box where he kept his medals, now joined by a single silver coin, and sat. The house was quiet again. There were no cameras, no crowds, no clapping hands, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of something won not through force, not through pride, but through simple presence. And for Chuck Norris, that would always be enough, because some men don't need the spotlight. They just need to be where they said they would be, and to stay there no matter what. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for powerful true stories you won't want to miss. And if this one meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.